Hey guys, this is a lesson on how to recognize the relationships, or rather what the relationships are between the different types of logical reasoning questions. So one of our users had asked if I could do a video on just, like, hey, this is a strengthening question, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So, I was thinking I had already done something like that in each of the, so in my strengthening videos, I kind of do say that, like, oh, this is a strengthening question, you got to do this and this. But I thought it did give me an idea, which is that, I don't think too many people realize just how many different ways there are to categorize logical reasoning questions, and most of it has to do with the fact that they have so many different kinds of relationships between them. So here you'll just see honestly, a lot of companies, test prep companies out there, categorize logical reasoning questions very differently, and I want to show you that it's really kind of superficial. I want to show you that the difference, of course, is important. You have to recognize what kind of question stem you're dealing with. It's very important, but I think it might just be kind of a little overplayed, as in it's not that it's not important, it's just there's undue emphasis on it. Okay, actually, maybe it's not undue emphasis. It is, again, it is really important, but I just think there's something that's more important, which is that you have to recognize the logical relationship of the logical structure of the argument in the LR questions, either the argument or the logical relationship between the statements. Because if you can do that, then you can recognize the fact that sometimes, and often actually, a weakening question has more in common with another strengthening question or with another reconcile question as it does with another weakening question, you see. Sometimes a necessary assumption question has more in common with a weakening question than it does with another necessary assumption question, although those are rare. But that's my point. You really don't want to think about logical reasoning questions exclusively as being categorized by its question stem. You're just not doing yourself a service there, because you're going to obscure a lot of the very important relationships that actually exist across logical reasoning question types. Okay, so the first way to categorize these questions is it's the what I wrote up on the Pre Pro Bono website, which is the way they want you to engage with the stimulus. It's the way they want you to engage with the stimulus. So that's where I say, oh, there's level 1, level 2, level 3. So here I'll just briefly describe what I mean by that. So level 1 questions. I call them surface level questions. They're level 1 questions. They're surface level questions because the kind of analysis you need to do is very, very shallow. It's on the surface. So that includes this guy right here, main point. So main point questions definitely belong in this group. It's because if you think about a main point question, think about the kind of question stem a main point question will ask you. They simply ask you to identify the main point. That's it. That's all it is. See, they'll give you an argument, and of course they'll try to obscure what the main point is. It's never going to be something like, well, actually, it's rarely ever going to be, the main point is rarely ever going to be the last sentence. I actually can't recall if there was ever a single LSAT LR question where they ask you to identify the main point, and they actually put the main point as the last sentence, or prefaced it with a word like thus. And when they do that, it's just, most likely it's to trick you. Or maybe not you, because you're watching this video, and that tells me at least you're trying to study for the LSAT. It's probably to trick those people who never really picked up an LSAT book or studied in any way, and they just think, oh, the last sentence of an argument must be the main point, which, of course, you guys know that's not true. So anyway, but that was quite an aside. All I wanted to say is that, why do I call this level 1 question? Well, it's because they just don't care whether this is a good argument or a bad argument. What are the flaws in the argument? Is there a gap between the premise and conclusion? None of that stuff matters. It just doesn't matter. You just need to identify the main point, you see. That's why I call it's a surface level question, because that's it. You have this argument, premises here, main point here. I call it labeling questions, because yeah, they just don't care whether you think this is a good argument or a bad argument or what. I mean, analyzing it is just not the point. It's a labeling exercise. You have an argument. You got a sentence here. You got another sentence here. You got a third sentence here. All they want you to do is just slap labels on it. Oh, this is context. Okay, this is a premise. This is a subconclusion, and this right here is the main conclusion. That's all. Is there a gap here between here and here? Sure, maybe. Maybe there's a huge gap. Maybe there isn't a gap. Who cares? They don't care, so you shouldn't care either. That's why this is a level 1 question. This is why I think everyone should start with LR. Everyone should start with main point questions, because honestly, if you can't even identify what the main point is, how are you going to do any of this other stuff that they're going to want you to do? Okay, so that's level 1. Now, another question type that I've been putting into level 1 is argument part. But then, I've been, I don't know, some of this stuff, I think I know what I'm doing, and then like later on, I'm like, okay, wait a second, I think I was wrong. So this is one of these things I'm not quite too certain about. And so argument part questions are like, they'll say, oh, this, they'll quote like 10 words or something from the stimulus. They'll say those 10 quoted words from the stimulus, what role does it play in the argument? That's the argument part. See, I used to always think of this as the same as main point questions, that, it's, instead of main point questions, say, hey, here's a main point label, slap it on the right sentence in the stimulus. Whereas our argument part question is kind of like the opposite. It's like, hey, here's a quotation from the stimulus. Tell me what label to slap on it. Do you see? So I started looking at some of the answers, and a lot of the answers are like, oh, it begins with, it's a premise that blah 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 blah. It's a premise that blah 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 blah. It's evidence for, it's support for, it's a position being argued against. So that, it's not quite the same as main point, because it's a little bit harder. You actually have to understand, I think, more. You do have to understand a little bit more. So now I'm starting to think maybe argument part is kind of similar to method or reasoning questions in that respect. So I just copied and pasted a sample argument part question, because I think it makes more sense to talk about it with an example. So this one says, which one of the following describes the role played by this in the argument by the statement that? So this is the quotation part, or I guess they phrase it differently here. There's no quotations here, but sometimes they'll actually quote it. Here they just point to the statement they want you to figure out what role it plays. So what role it plays right here. So you see, I mean, what's the role that it's going to play? It's going to be either premise or evidence or support. I mean, I think of the term premise very broadly. So evidence, support, all that, I just think of as subsets of premise. But see, in the answer choices, or it's context, or it's a point being argued against, or something. But you see, I say it's harder than main point, because main point is just main point. It's just the main point. There's really not that much variation to it. Here, the answer choices, there's so much room for the answer choices to mess with you, because in the answer choices, like all 5 will say it's a premise. Let's say this is a premise, right? So all 5 answer choices will say it's a premise. And then each of those 5 answer choices, after the word premise, there will be like 10 extra words that get into the details of, like, just what kind of premise it is, or what statement it supports. And that's where the answer choices can go wrong. So this is why it's not as superficial as the main point question. This one is a little bit harder, but it's not quite the same as the method or reasoning question either, because method or reasoning question makes you focus on the entire argument. You basically need to describe the role played in the argument by every sentence in the argument. So that's a method or reasoning question. So in some sense it's like main point, in some other sense it's like method or reasoning, in that it's just, instead of describing the entire argument, describing a subset of the argument. Specifically, which subset? Well, this subset right here. And as this video lesson goes on, you'll see how there's just so many parallels between different types of questions. This is just one way of categorizing these different question steps. After I'm done with this way, I'll just completely start over and show you the other similarities that exist. So moving on from level 1 questions, we move to, of course, level 2 questions, which, so again, level 1 I call it labeling questions. Level 2, it's I call these engaging and analyzing questions. And the reason is because this is the level of questions where they're actually asking you to engage in the argument and to analyze the argument. So if you can make out my chicken scratch handwriting here, it's engage and analyze. So this type of question includes the strengthening type, the necessary assumption type, the sufficient assumption type, the weakening, and the evaluate type. So all of these belong to this second level of questions. So just exactly what is engage and analyze? Well, for level 1 questions, all you were asked to do is figure out the different parts of the argument. This is the premise, this is the conclusion. So after you do that, then what? What's the next thing they could ask you to do? Well, they could ask you, does the premise support the conclusion? Or they'll ask that question in a variation of ways. Strengthening questions ask you to make the premise support the conclusion more. But you see, in order to do all of these types of questions, you have to be able to do this first. So you have to know what the main point is. You have to know what each of the argument parts are doing. You see, that's why the natural progression, I think, in terms of your studying is this. But, then again, I'll show you, like I had alluded to earlier, I'll show you a different, the other similarities that exist across questions. But okay, so far as building blocks go, if you can't do this type of question, I don't think you have any business doing this type of question. So back to strengthening questions. They'll ask you, once you identify the premise conclusion, they'll say, okay, so how do you make these premises support the conclusion even more? You see, that's strengthening. And on the flip side of that is weakening. You identify the premise and conclusion, they'll ask you, okay, how do you make it such that the premises don't support the conclusion as much as you thought it did? And here I'll just stress another point that I think often gets overlooked on strengthening and weakening questions. And this is the point that separates out the 170 scorers from the rest, which is that people who score that high realize that when you are asked to strengthen an argument or weaken an argument, you're not being asked to strengthen the conclusion or weaken the conclusion. There's a clear distinction between argument and conclusion. Argument is premise plus conclusion. Really, when they ask you to strengthen or weaken an argument, they're asking you to strengthen or weaken the relationship that exists between the premise and conclusion. They're asking you to focus on this abstract relationship, this support that exists between the premise and conclusion. Too often people will, they're told, LSAT students, it's not like they figure this stuff out themselves. They're told by either books or, test prep companies that they take classes with, oh, hey, weakening questions, attack the conclusion, attack the conclusion. Strengthening questions, support the conclusion. I mean, yeah, that works sometimes. It works for the questions that everybody gets right. It works for, if you want to score in the 150, maybe even 160, you can do this. It's fine. You can do this. LSAT does not make a distinction between those easy questions. But on the harder weakening, strengthening questions, the curve breaker questions, that's not what they do. The answer choice is subtle. The answer choice is subtle precisely because it's irrelevant to the conclusion. Irrelevant to the conclusion either in the strengthening sense or the weakening sense. It just is. And they're supposed to be irrelevant to the conclusion because the question stem is asking you to strengthen or weaken the argument. Do you see the argument? This whole thing is the argument. The conclusion is not the argument. The conclusion is a part of the argument, just like the premise is a part of the argument. So when they're asking you to strengthen or weaken an argument, you need to make the premise either more relevant to the conclusion or make the premise less relevant to the conclusion. And point in case, watch the two recent strengthening videos I put up, one about the cows and methane, and the other about, if people walk to work instead of driving cars. Those two strengthening questions exactly show you why the correct answer choice is so subtle. It's so subtle because it does not support the conclusion. What it rather does is it makes their existing premises in the stimulus more relevant for the conclusion. And that's precisely what a strengthening question is supposed to do. And the weakening the same way. I'm pretty sure every single weakening question does this. Even the really easy ones, it's just the distinction just doesn't come apart. That's all for the easy questions, which is that it makes the existing premises less relevant for the conclusion. Yeah, some of the really easy weakening questions just go out of their way to wreck the conclusion. Which is fine because it's easy to see. If your answer choice wrecks the conclusion, everyone's focused on the conclusion, so it's really easy to see. So of course everyone's going to get those questions right. But it's those harder questions where the answer choice or the correct answer choice doesn't wreck the conclusion. Rather, it just wrecks the support. You see, it wrecks this abstract thing here called support. It wrecks the support. And then, if you don't know that's what you're doing, you're going to look at this answer choice and be like, hey, this is totally irrelevant to the conclusion. Cross it out. And there, they got you. You're going to go you already cross out the right answer choice. They definitely have a attractive incorrect answer choice that seems to wreck the conclusion because they know that's what you're thinking, waiting for you, and you're going to pick it. And that's how you get it wrong. So, okay. I know this is a huge aside and it's totally irrelevant to what we're talking about here, but it just really bothers me that all this material out there is giving people just bad advice. I mean, it's just incorrect. It's just wrong. It's false. Alright, so back to what we were talking about, engagement and analysis. And then, of course, you have the evaluate questions, which ask a question evaluate question stems, which the answer choices all ask questions, and the evaluate questions are just a combination of weakening, strengthening questions. So for example, think about an argument, a very simple argument, like, like say you and I are going to, I don't know, the movies or something, and then we're in New York City, and we have to get there before 8 o'clock. So I say, hey, you know what? Don't worry, we'll get there on time. Why? Because we can catch a cab. That's my argument. We can catch a cab, therefore we'll get there on time. Not a great argument, right? I mean, if you know anything about, just think about it for a second. Like, how many assumptions am I making? First of all, that there are cabs available. Second of all, there's no traffic. And third of all, well, okay, whatever. You know what? That's good. That's already bad enough. We don't need to go on. The assumptions I'm making is that, say that there's no traffic. Okay, to strengthening question. You just identify the assumption, and then you say there really isn't any traffic. So do you see how that strengthens my argument? Now my premise of we can catch a cab is more strongly supports the conclusion that we will get there on time, because there's no traffic. Because you just stipulated that there's no traffic. You see. Now if you want to weaken it, it's easy. You just flip it on the side. So weakening, you just say, okay, well now there is traffic. So now my premise that we can catch a cab supports less strongly my conclusion that we'll get there on time. Evaluate question, you just ask a question of this. You say, hey, is there traffic? Is there traffic? You answer yes, then there is traffic. Then it weakens my argument. You answer no, there isn't traffic, then it strengthens my argument. So these three question types are exactly the same. They can easily change, strengthening to a weakening to evaluate and back and forth. All right, so now we're left with a sufficient and necessary assumption question. These are very different, but they all exist in this level of engagement and analysis, because you need to know what the premises are and what the conclusion is in order to figure out what the necessary assumption is. You see, but that's not how that's less helpful here. Just knowing in an abstract way what level this type of question asks you to engage with an argument is not that helpful, because for this type of question you really do need to know the mechanism of how to do it. But I'll get to that. I'll get to that later when I discuss how they're similar to other types of questions. And then, of course, you have the sufficient assumption questions, which, yeah, they just ask you to make your existing premises entirely sufficient. Your existing premises plus the right answer choice you choose, you get that, and then you have yourself a valid argument. So you see, you also need to understand the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So that's an engagement analysis. Now, I understand I'm not telling you how to approach. Well, I guess I did kind of for this weakening and strengthening, but I'm not really trying to tell you how to approach these questions. I'll get to that later when I start drawing similarities between these question types, which I guess I've also kind of started to do here. Okay, so anyway, the third level of questions. So we got labeling, engagement analysis, descriptive level. I think of this descriptive level right here. I think of this as it's kind of a meta level question, and don't get thrown off by that word meta. It just means like you kind of think of it as taking a bird's eye view from above. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, first of all, these two are the descriptive levels, the method of reasoning and the flawed method of reasoning questions. So if you think about a typical method of reasoning question, you got the question stem says, oh, which one of the following the argument proceeds by. Simplest type of method of reasoning question. The argument proceeds by. And all of your answer choices will begin with verbs. It'll begin with verbs. Either it will begin with verbs or the verb has been embedded into the question stem itself. And what is that? See, when an answer choice begins with a verb, the subject matter is the argument. They'll say the argument does what? The argument does what? Do you see? The argument is subject matter. The predicate it begins with a verb, and you are being asked to describe what the argument does. See, of course you need to know what the main point is. You need to know each part of the argument. You need to know what the premise is, what the conclusion is. And you kind of do need to know somewhat. For this, less so. For this, much more so. But you do need to kind of know somewhat, like, where all this stuff too, because this is the kind of question that they dwell in that space between the premise and conclusion, the space of assumption, the space of where the argument might go wrong. So yeah, you kind of need to know this stuff. Again, less so for method of reasoning, more so for flawed method of reasoning. But at the end of the day, you're simply being asked to describe the argument. You see, you're kind of detached. What you're doing is kind of detached from this. Like, to take that taxi example again, for a flaw method of reasoning question, or flaw method is, I use the word flaw almost reluctantly because not all of them are flaw. What counts as logical flaw is kind of arbitrary. So you have really, I think of them as descriptive weakening questions. And I use flaw because, well, that's what everyone out there knows these questions as, flaw. And yeah, some of them really are flaws. Some of them are well-documented logical flaws that logicians have identified for thousands of years. And they really are flaws. But most of the questions that people call flaw questions are really not flaw questions. They're just descriptive weakening questions. So what does that mean, descriptive weakening? Well, again, consider my argument. We'll catch a cab, therefore we'll get to it on time. You say, the argument inappropriately assumes that there is traffic. Do you see? You're saying the argument, what about the argument? Well, it inappropriately assumes. You see, attach a verb. You're saying the argument is doing something wrong. But what's the wrong thing it's doing? It's making a wrong assumption. You see how that's very similar to the weakening question type? I mean, the weakening question type, you just say, oh, you don't say like, oh, the argument. It's almost like you're criticizing the argument. It's almost like you're like chastising the argument for doing this bad thing. For a weakening question, you're just going up there and like punching the argument in the face. You're like, no, look, there is traffic outside. Do you see? Whereas here it's like, oh, you better be careful not to assume there's traffic outside. Do you see? So that's kind of the difference there. And of course, for method reasoning, typically there's nothing wrong with the argument. So you just say, oh, the argument, denies the argument sets out all possibilities for resolving an issue, and rejects 4 of the 5 possibilities, therefore concluding that it must be the 5th possibility that resolves the issue or something. So you see, again, it's very descriptive. It's very detached. All right, and finally, the 4th level of question. The 4th level is it's kind of like this descriptive level too. And I typically don't on the website it's not even categorized, but I started to think that at this point it kind of becomes, I don't even know if it's all that helpful, but I suppose it's good to know. It's not incredible, knowing this stuff, I think only like is the bare minimum. You have to know this stuff, but it's not going to help you very much to actually get the questions right. But again, you kind of have to know this stuff. It gives you a framework for how to, for sort of putting things in their right places. But just knowing that, I think it helps to clarify certain things, but it doesn't, I really don't think it helps you answer the questions right that much. But, of course, what does? Well, practice does, But okay, so for this parallel reasoning question stuff, it's really like the level 4, because what you're doing is you're being asked to do this descriptive stuff anyway. Once you get an argument, you get a concrete argument, which is in your stimulus. Get a concrete argument. And what are you being asked to do with this concrete argument? You're being asked to abstract away from it. See, you're being asked to do this. This is the abstraction. This stuff is the abstraction. You see, the method of reasoning, these are the forms of reasoning. Say the concrete argument says, oh, all Jedi use the Force, therefore, Luke Skywalker is Jedi, therefore Luke Skywalker uses the Force. That's the concrete argument. In the abstract form, just all A's are B's. Here's an A, therefore here's a B. You see, and that's what this method of reasoning and flaw method of reasoning does, is it describes the form of the argument. And then, once you abstract away, they want you to bring it down. That's the extra step. See, for the descriptive level, you're done. Once you get to this point, you're done. This is where the answer choice resides. For this type of question, you got to do this, but then once you do this, you got to bring it down, because here's where the answer choice resides. You got to bring it down to another concrete argument. You say something like, all bananas are delicious. The Cavendish is a banana, therefore the Cavendish is delicious. So do you see, it shares the argument form. So that's this parallel reasoning question. Alright, so now let's deal with these other question types here. So you might have guessed already, these are all question types with arguments in them. You see, these are all question types. If there's an argument present, they're going to ask you to do these, something like this. Typically speaking. Now, of course, sometimes there are arguments present and they actually ask you to do this stuff. So it's not 100% true. And of course, there's no reason. It's not like the LSAT has written down somewhere, okay, if we write an argument, then we can only ask this type of question. No, why would they do that? So these are at best, all of this at best, they're just rules of thumb, which is why it's all the more important that you recognize the broad similarity across all the different LR types, which I'm about to get to here when I talk about this question. This how to organize this stuff, and then to start drawing parallels. All right, so over here I want to start with the inference question type. So inference question type. You know, you guys know what inferences are. They give you some statements up here, and then they say, from this, what must be true? Now, that's just logical validity. That's all this is. It's logical validity. The definition of valid is if the statements above are true, then the statement below must be true. Or really, the valid is if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. But then, of course, replace premise with statement above and replace conclusion with statement below, and you get the same kind of definition. Okay, so, you know, typically speaking, they don't have arguments in this type of question. They just give you just a list of facts, if you will. And for the most strongly supported question, they're very similar to inference questions. In fact, you know what? Some of them are almost just like inference questions. Sometimes I look at a most strongly supported question, and I look at the right answer choice, and I can't even tell why it's not valid. And now, of course, sometimes the reason is because you know, I'm not smart enough. I can't see the subtle assumption that they're making. But sometimes it's because the answer choice is actually valid. Do you see, if they ask for which one of the following below is most strongly supported by the statement above, why can't they give you an answer choice that's valid? See, if I tell you, you know, all Jedi use the Force, Luke Skywalker is a Jedi, which one of the following answer choices below is most strongly supported? Well, the valid conclusion to draw is that Luke Skywalker is a Force user. He uses the Force. Of course, he must use the Force. This is an inference. This is the correct answer choice in an inference question. So, of course, it's also going to be a correct answer choice to the most strongly supported question, because this is asking for a weaker standard to be met. This is a stronger standard to be met. So if you meet the stronger standard, of course you meet the weaker standard. But I suspect the reason why they do this is sometimes they give an answer choice, and there's kind of disagreement about like whether, you know, these test writers, I see them like sitting together at a table, like kind of disagreeing over whether a subtle assumption has been introduced or not. And then to settle the dispute, instead of actually figuring out whether a subtle assumption has been introduced, they just say, you know what, let's just make it a most strongly supported question type. So in that way, either you win and there is a subtle assumption introduced, or I win and there is no subtle assumption introduced. Either way, we all win because we asked for a most strongly supported answer choice. So do you see, so they're kind of similar. Now, of course, there are plenty of most strongly supported answer questions that actually have huge assumptions in them, and those are the ones that students find hard, because those are the ones that you're like, well, I don't know if I want to choose this one, because you see, I know I have to assume X, Y, and Z, and especially the high-scoring students, they find this very hard, because, you know, they're so used to not introducing any assumptions. But then, of course, for most strongly supported, you get to introduce assumptions. But it's just the reasonableness of the assumptions where you have to make a judgment call on. And the right answer choice, if it does carry an assumption with it, the right answer choice, that assumption will be much, much more reasonable than any of the wrong answer choices. The wrong answer choices will just will get you to make outlandish assumptions. Whereas the right answer choice, the subtle right answer choice, will make an assumption. Then that's why it's subtle, because you're just not comfortable with it. You're like, oh, I don't want to choose this because it's, you know, the statements above don't really prove this. It's just you make an assumption out of it. All right, so that's what makes this kind of question type hard. And then you have the pointed issue questions, and actually before I get to that, the principal questions. These questions are also like the inference question. Either they'll give you conditional statements up in the stimulus and ask you for an answer choice that proves the conditional statement, or they'll give you or they'll switch it up and give you a story up in the stimulus and ask you for a conditional statement and answer choice which the story exemplifies. So, you know, again, just to boil this down to like something, you know, super simple, they'll say something like, no one is a Jedi who does not use the Force. No one is a Jedi who does not use the Force. That'll be in the stimulus, say. So what do you write? You just write J, arrow, F. And in the answer choices, A will say something like, oh, you know, Darth Vader uses the Force. Therefore, we conclude he must be a Jedi. And you know, that's not right. Do you see? That's not right, because that's if you translated this the other way around. But answer choice B would be right, because answer choice B will say something like, oh, Luke Skywalker is a Jedi. Therefore, we conclude Luke Skywalker uses the Force. So see, this will be right. Okay, now they could flip it around. They can say in this up in the stimulus, they'll say, oh, Luke Skywalker is a Jedi. Therefore, Luke Skywalker uses the Force. And then the answer choice A will say something like, all Force users are Jedi. Does this illustrate all Force users are Jedi? No, because we concluded he's a Force user. B would be correct, and B would say all Jedi use the Force. You see, so that's how this principal question works. It really is an inference question type. Okay, so with principal questions, I also want to take an aside and just point out something. So I just told you what principal questions are. If you look at the videos that I put up for principal questions, you know, I kind of repeat myself there. But the issue I have is people tend to miscategorize principal questions. The material out there, like the class that you're taking or the book that you're using, I bet you they're going to categorize this as a principal question because it has the word principal in it. Well, of course it's a principal question, right? Because it's got the word principal in it. Well, no, that's not right. I just told you what a principal question was. Look at this question. Which one of the following principles, if valid, most helps to justify the counselor reasoning above? So what if you deleted the word principle? Which one of the following answer choices, obviously, if valid, most helps to justify? Does that change anything? What, now that you don't know that below the answer choice is a quote-unquote principle, you can't get the question right? This is just a strengthening question. It's a strengthening, and I call this a pseudo-sufficient assumption question because typically the answer choice will match the form of a sufficient assumption question much better than the form of a strengthening question. But do you see, don't get fooled by this. The word principle in here does nothing. It adds nothing. So what if you know the answer choice is a quote-unquote principle, or if it's not a principle? So what? This is asking you to strengthen the argument, likely to make it a valid argument. In other words, this is asking you to find a sufficient assumption. Just because it has the word principle in there doesn't do anything. All right, and then finally, the two last question types here. The point at issue questions are pretty. I don't know what to say. They're kind of straightforward. Point at issue questions. The two people are either agreeing on a point, so you have to identify a logical equivalent statement between the two people, or they disagree on a point, in which case you have to identify a logical contradiction. Do you see? Logical contradiction is, of course, very much related to the inference question type, because that's just where you deal with formal logic. So that's all the point at issue is. And the reconcile, you get two statements that seem to be logically contradictory. So very similar to, so point at issue questions, sort of split into agree and disagree questions. It's like inference questions split into must be true, must be false questions. Must be true, must be false questions. Point at issue, of course, is split into agree and disagree questions. Reconcile is, kind of similar in this respect because reconcile questions have two statements that seem to be in disagreement, seem to be in contradiction with each other. Carl is the best detective on the force. However, Carl's average solve rate for his cases is 10%, whereas his colleagues, the average is 80%. So do you see how these two statements seem to be in contradiction? But of course they're not in contradiction. Because what is a true contradiction? Carl is the best detective on the force. No, Carl is not the best detective on the force. That's a true contradiction. See, the two statements that you're presented with just seem like a contradiction. Why can't he be the best detective on? Maybe he solves it. Maybe maybe every case he works on, his colleagues have already tried and failed at. So their solve rate on his cases is 0%. His solve rate on those cases is 10%. Do you see? He's still the best. Or possibly he works on 10 billion cases a year. 10% of that, you do the math. Whereas his colleagues work on 100 cases a year. So you see 80% of that is 10 billion, 10%, 1 billion. 1 billion cases. So he solves 1 billion cases. All right. So do you see, it seems to be a contradiction. It's not really a contradiction. All right, okay, so enough of this. I want to start showing you stuff that probably you don't know, which is how interrelated all this stuff is. All right, actually, I lied. Just one last point. This question stem right here, this question type, which one of the following question stem rather of which one of the following most logically completes argument. This is very malleable. You can't say this is. Most people will say this is a main point question. Again, they're just wrong. Yeah, sometimes it's like a main point question. This question stem is typically preceded with a stimulus where there's a blank at the end of it. There's just a blank, like fill in the blank. Well, I mean, first of all, even if they're asking you to fill it in with a main point, it's not like a main point question, because main point questions, the main point has already been stated in the stimulus. You're just being asked to identify it. Here, if they really want you to figure out what the main point is over here, then they're asking you to draw the main point, which is more like a most strongly supported. It's more like a most strongly supported question, because then they're asking you to take all the premises above and use all of it to support this blank, what goes in the blank, which is the answer choices, you see. So of course it's like a most strongly supported. The only difference is that most strongly supported questions, the correct answer choice, could maybe use just one of these statements, whereas this, they have used all the statements because they're asking you to find the main conclusion of the argument in the answer choice below. But you see, you're being asked to draw the main conclusion. You're not just being asked to identify the main conclusion. This type of question, they they already did it for you. They already drew the conclusion for you. They just want to see if you can identify it. Here, they didn't draw the conclusion for you. They need you to understand these premises and figure out which one of the 5 answer choices is most strongly supported by the premises, which is just a definition of conclusion. Statements that receive support, you see. Now, of course, I said this is malleable because it's not always the case. Sometimes they'll preface this with a, because. Because, comma, blah, blah, blah. You see, if they preface it with because, none of this stuff is relevant anymore. What does because introduce? Because always introduces premise, either sub-premise or main premise. Do you see? So if they preface with this, then they're asking you to identify a premise. If they say, after all, comma, blank, then again, they're asking you for a premise. So you see, this is a very malleable question type, which one following most logically completes argument. And this is becoming, they start having this more and more, so you can't really categorize this. But okay, again, another reason why it's just so much more important to understand how all these questions are really interchangeable. Okay, so I promise this lesson's already being drawn out, and I'm gonna get to it. Okay, so you've already seen some of the parallels. I'm going to draw some parallels that maybe you haven't seen already. So I already explained why weaken, strengthening, evaluate are all the same question types. I already told you this. Now I want to point out something that perhaps you haven't realized, which is that reconcile weakening questions are very similar to each other. Often, all a reconcile question is a weakening question that they left out the premise, conclusion, structure. Okay, so let's just illustrate this. Let me illustrate this point with an example. So this was a question on us. I'm just kind of paraphrasing because I don't actually remember which LSAT it was from, and so it's going to be kind of tough to look this up. But so basically, it went something like this. You got a lot of people on a cruise ship, and some of them are taking seasickness medication. Some of them are taking it, and then they say, oh, but despite this, people who took it, these people, were more likely to report symptoms of nausea, of seasickness, nausea from seasickness. So you got a bunch of people, say 100 people, 50 of them took the seasickness medication, and then of those 50 people, say like 40 of them reported symptoms of seasickness, whereas of the 50 people that didn't take it, only say like 5 of them reported symptoms of seasickness. You see, so that right there sets up what is classically a reconcile, resolve the paradox stimulus. And then, of course, what's the resolution? Well, the resolution, the right answer choice here is just, well, look, who do you think takes seasickness medication in the first place? Probably those people who already know they're going to be prone to being seasick. No one just, well, okay, I was going to say no one just pops pills for fun, but, that's not true. But in this context, I suppose no one pops seasickness pills for fun. So the resolution here is that people who are more inclined to get this, seasickness, or people who are more inclined to do this, they're going to take seasickness medication, which is why you got 40 of them took it, because guess what? It still showed that it worked, because all 50 of them would have reported symptoms of seasickness, but because all 50 of them took the pills, only 40% of them reported symptoms of seasickness. So see, that's the classic reconcile kind of answer choice, you see. Now to make this into a weakening question, it's easy. They just say, look, you got same thing, 100 people, 50 of them took the pill, 50 of them did not take the pill. Despite this, the people who did take the pill were more likely to report symptoms of seasickness. They just have to add a conclusion. They just have to say, therefore, seasickness medication is not effective. You see, that becomes an argument. You have this context here, you have the premise here, and you have the conclusion here. So this becomes context, this becomes premise, this becomes conclusion. Now they made it into a weakening question. You see? And the correct answer choice, same thing. The correct answer choice is the same thing. It's that people who are more prone to getting this, people who are more prone to reporting symptoms of seasickness, they're the ones that are going to be taking the seasickness medication. Do you see how introducing this premise weakens, takes away, introducing this answer choice / premise, takes away the support that this premise gives to this conclusion? Do you see how the reconcile and the weakening are really the same? Okay, I'm not saying you can do this for every single question type, but just the fact that you can do them for a large subset of them should tell you something. And what it should tell you is that this reconcile question type is very similar to the weakening question type. You see, and then look, that's just one step away from being similar to strengthen and evaluate question type. You see, because these three are all the same. So you see, like already, okay, so I just linked up these 4 question types. All right, so let's move on to a different kind of, another relationship that exists here. All right, now I want to talk about the weakening versus the descriptive weakening, the descriptive weakening question, the flawed method of weakening, or method of reasoning question. Okay, earlier I had just said, the way you do flaw method of reasoning questions, you just take the assumption, and then you just say, oh, the argument inappropriately assumes X. Let's say the assumption is X. The assumption, whatever the assumption is, it's X. Call it X. There's traffic, or it's actually raining outside. When it rains, nobody gets a cab. So let's say that's the assumption. Descriptive answer choice will say the argument inappropriately assumes X. The weakening answer choice will simply say not X. Do you see how it's exactly the same? It's just like a cosmetic differences between the two types of questions. All right, so these two now are the same, which means that you see now which means this is now the same as this, the same as this, the same as this. So now all these are linked. So earlier I also pointed out how these two are the same. I don't know if you caught that, but inference question would say all Jedi use the Force. Here's a Jedi. What's the right answer choice? The answer choice would say here's a Force user. How does the principal question go? The principal question just takes this part of it and this part of it, and they shove it into the answer choices. That's how the principal goes, right? The principal will be all Jedi use the Force. And then the answer choice, the correct answer choice, oh, here's a Jedi, therefore here's a Force user. Do you see? So now these two types of questions are very similar. So the most strongly supported in the inference are also similar in the sense I kind of talked about already, which is that you got to prove the answer choice. It's just this is not exactly logically. There's something logically missing about this. It's not exactly valid. The right answer choice isn't exactly valid. So then I also said that this point of issue question is very similar to the inference question, because the point of issue question, for the disagreement part of the point of issue questions, it's just like the must be false. The disagreement point of issue questions is exactly the same as must be false questions, because the must be false questions ask you to identify a logical contradiction. One person says X, the other person says nope, not X. Now for the must be false, typically what happens is they'll give you two premises, premise 1, premise 2, and then from these premises you get to draw a conclusion that they don't really draw, because they want to hide it. But from these two premises, they're committed to draw the conclusion. So person 1 would say, hey, you know what? All Jedi use the Force, and Luke is a Jedi. So what's the conclusion to be drawn? Well, of course that Luke is the Force user. But then, of course, this person is not going to say it. He doesn't say it. He just says, all Jedi use the Force, and Luke is a Jedi. And then he stops talking. So see, what is to be drawn from that is that, therefore, Luke is, of course, he of course is committed to saying Luke is a Force user. He doesn't say it, but he's committed to saying it. And person 2 will say, okay, Luke is not a Force user. So do you see, there's your disagreement. And of course, there is also your must be false. Because if this is the statements that are above, this is the must be false answer choice. So it's, again, so they're kind of the same thing. And I think that's kind of it now for now. I think these are all the parallels that I've seen. And it really helps to see I'm sorry, I'm sorry, that's not it at all. Necessary assumption question. I completely forgot about these guys. Necessary assumption questions are just like inference questions, as are sufficient assumption questions. They're also just like inference questions, but in very different ways. So in the necessary assumption questions, you get the inference. It's just like making an inference. The statements above are true. The conclusion below must also be true. That's what the inference question says. Necessary assumption question, instead of the statements above, it's the argument above. If the argument above is valid, then one of these points must be true, which means the argument above is premise, conclusion. Of course, there's some gap here. But when this is set to be valid, with the gap, this thing must be true. So it's just like an inference question. In fact, I say this in the necessary assumption videos. Go there for more details. But to sidestep the biggest trap they set for you, you want to think of necessary assumption questions as straight inference questions. So that's this similarity right here. And now the sufficient assumption questions being connected to the inference questions, it's even more stark. I mean, this is like the inference question will again say all Jedi use the Force. Here is a Jedi. Then what? I'm going to put in brackets the answer choice. The answer choice will say here's a Force user. The sufficient assumption question will say here's all Jedi use the Force. Therefore, here's the Force user. And in the bracket will be the answer that this person must be a Jedi. Or alternatively, they'll say here's a Jedi, here's the Force user, and in the brackets, which is the answer choice, they'll say all Jedi. You'll have to pick out that all Jedi use the Force. So you see, it's the same exercise, but in from a different approach. And earlier, I already pointed out how most strongly supported questions are just like main point questions, because the main point, what is the main point? It's the statement that receives the support. That's what conclusion means. Statement that is supported. So of course, most strongly supported questions are just like main point questions. So you see, knowing this, you just start to see all the parallel. Look, reconcile questions is like weakening questions, which is like strengthening questions, which is like evaluate questions, which is like weakening questions, which is like flaw method of reasoning questions. All these are linked together. Necessary assumption questions link to inference questions, link to sufficient assumption questions, link to principal questions, which over here are also linked to point at issue disagreement questions. So you see this logical map that links everything together is really what shows you how the LSAT for logical reasoning, they really just are testing your understanding of, one, logic. Do you understand logic? And I mean, so much of this stuff, all the inference stuff depends on logic. And two, do you understand what an argument is? And those two are very closely intertwined. Of course, the unrelated skill to all that is English grammar parsing, which is kind of tough and doesn't really fit on here. But that's another lesson for another day. But yeah, I just want to, here I'll clean this up so you can see the map better and how everything really is linked together. Okay, so finally, one last point I want to make. One last point I want to make is, this is actually a very crucial point for getting the questions right, is knowing what you ought to be skeptical of and what you ought to accept. All right, so this last point is actually kind of helpful for getting the right answer choice, and especially for sidestepping wrong ones, which is knowing what you accept and knowing what you're supposed to be skeptical of or prove. So for the main point questions, you have to accept the statements above and prove the answer choice below. Because if you think C is right, the only reason why C is right is because C paraphrases the conclusion. The answer choice C paraphrases the conclusion. Where do you find the conclusion? In the stimulus. You got to take the information that is in the stimulus and use it to prove your answer choices. So be skeptical of your answer choices. So this is the stuff you accept up here, and this is the stuff you prove down here. So what you accept and what you prove. Same with argument part. It goes this way. What you accept is up here. And why do you say this is a premise? Well, you say this is a premise because you can point back to the stuff up above in the stimulus to show how this is a premise. So you accept the stuff above, you prove the stuff below. Same with inference questions. You prove it. You accept the statements up above, and you use it to prove your answer choice. Same with most strongly supported. Same with principle. Same with point and issue. Same with method of reasoning. So inference, actually most strongly supported, I just talked about inference. Most strongly supported is, well, actually very similar to inference, right? Because you just accept the stuff above. Most strongly supports one of the answer choices below. So be skeptical of the stuff below. Be skeptical of the stuff below here, too, for the inference questions. Principal questions, same thing. Why do you say the correct answer choice is what it is? Because the principles up above allow you to prove this. Point and issue. Why do you say that, whether someone is a force user is a point and issue? Because you can just look above. Look, he says he's a force user. This guy says he's not a force user. I proved it. Method of reasoning, same thing. Why do you say this is the method of reasoning? Because you can just point up to the stuff above to prove this. Technically, flawed method of reasoning is the same way. Except this is not so helpful. If you think about it like this, it's not all that helpful. Because like I said, flawed method reasoning is really a descriptive weakening question, which, I think just psychologically the way to think about it is actually the other way. And to understand this here, let me talk about weakening first. Of course, weakening questions, the information is reversed because you're asked to accept the information below. Accept each of the answer choices below and see if the answer choices below which you accept does the thing the question asks you to do for the stuff above. Which here the instruction is to weaken. So accepting the answer choice here, does it weaken the stuff above? Does it weaken the argument above? Now, for flaw method reasoning, now do you see why it's the same thing? Because yeah, even though technically it's describing the flaw, but I think the way your brain is really thinking, your mind is really thinking about how it works is that if I accept the stuff below, is it actually hurting the argument above? So that's why you want to push it up this way. This again is like this. A sufficient assumption also pushes up because you accept the correct answer choice below and then see if it actually makes the argument above valid. Strengthening is, of course, the same way. You accept the answer choice below, see if it actually strengthens the argument above. Evaluate the same way. You accept the answers below and see if it actually points up to see if it actually affects the argument, either by weakening it or strengthening it. Reconcile, of course, is also the same way because you accept the answer choices below and see if it resolves the paradox above or explains the paradox above. Necessary assumption technically is the same because technically necessary assumption is the answer choice below is supposed to be a necessary assumption for the statement above. But necessary assumption questions, you really want to think about it as pointing down because like I said, it's more like an inference question that way. You accept the argument above. It forces out your necessary assumption. That's why necessary assumption you want to think about pointing this way. And of course, parallel reasoning, it's kind of like a abstract point down. I mean, if you have to fit it into this, it's a pointing down. But I don't really see what the point is of. I guess for completion, you want to fit everything in. It points down. You accept the argument above, and then you have to abstract away, and then use the abstraction to prove that this is the right answer choice. So yeah, it points down also. So there you go. So this is sort of all the, I guess I kind of started to give you this leveling stuff. Then I talked about the how to organize this stuff and how the similarities that exist between all the different logical reasoning question stems. And finally, I'm telling you, I told you just now about the how the information, what you accept, what you prove, what you accept, what you affect. This is all. You got to know all this stuff. So there are many ways, there are many frameworks with which you can understand logical reasoning. You do have to know all this stuff because it just helps. Every one of this helps. I want to end this lesson on the same note that I began this lesson on, which is by stressing to you that it's not nearly as important to be able to recognize these question stems and like learning the differences between the question stems as it is to actually understand the structure of the argument, to understand why the premises don't support the conclusion or why the premises do support the conclusion. Because once you understand that, that is the core understanding, the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. Once you have this core understanding, you can answer any type of question they throw at you. And I hope that this lesson has illustrated to you how really malleable all of these question stems are, how similar they are to one another, how easily they can change one question type to another question type and back again, or into a third question type, into a fourth question type. But they never get away from the central issue of this is what the logical reasoning is about, the premises and how they support the conclusion. You can think of it like this. These are directions. This is like turn left, this is turn right, this is like go, north 25 degrees, then turn left. This is like, turn around and then walk 5 paces backwards. These are all directions of where to go. Yeah, you got to know this, because if you don't know this, you're not going to, you got to follow directions, you got to follow instructions. They tell you to do a weakening, you better not be strengthening. So yes, this is all important, but it's not nearly as important as doing this, because if you don't know the structure of this, if you don't know why the premises don't support conclusion, it doesn't matter what they ask you, you're not going to get it right. If you do know the structure of this, again, it doesn't matter what they ask you because you're going to get it right. So knowing the structure is like knowing where you are beginning, knowing where you're standing. So again, that analogy was this is like instructions to turn left, turn right, go forward, go backwards. But you have to know where you're standing first. You see, if you don't know this, it's like you don't even know where you are. So what if you know you need to turn right? You have no idea where you are to begin with. Do you see? And if you know where you are to begin with, then yeah, turning right's easy. Turning left is easy. It's knowing where you are that's hard. So I think you want to use that analogy to kind of think about the relationship between the various question stems on the LR section of the LSAT, the relationship between that and actually understanding the structure of an argument, which is the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. So I hope that was a helpful lesson in clarifying some of the relationships between these different question stems. And of course, if you need to, it was very cursory. If you want to actually get a lesson on how to do principal questions or inference questions, go into those specific videos.